Let's get this out of the way right now. I'm not an expert on ignoring women, but I am an expert on what ignoring reveals. And trust me, it's never what you think. Ignoring someone, the woman in your life, or really anyone, it's like holding up a mirror to your own inner story. Suddenly, her absence speaks. She's upset. She's too much. She's picking a fight. And none of it may be true. That's not emotional distance. That's emotional misreading. But let's not pretend silence is all bad sometimes. It's the only way we think we can survive contact. It buys us time, space, emotional armor. Yet, funny thing is, silence only works on yourself. For everyone else, it becomes a message. One that can say, you don't matter enough for an answer. That's the dark side of quiet. Yet, here's the kicker. Ignoring someone often says more about you than it does about them. It reflects fear. Fear of being overwhelmed, of asking too much, of confronting what's uncomfortable. It's projection wearing your face. So take a breath and ask with kindness what you're avoiding. We think we're so good at treading people, especially the people we care about most. We believe we can read into the silences, the pauses, the unanswered texts, the delayed responses, the seen messages that never get replied to. Our minds leap into action. We stitch together an entire narrative out of the absence of words. And that story, it feels so real, so convincing that we don't even stop to question it. But there's the catch. What you think you're interpreting is almost never what's actually happening. You're not reading them. You're reading yourself. That's the thing about emotional misdirection. You think you're decoding her behavior, but really you're making meaning from your own fear. She didn't reply to your message for a few hours. Your min jumps. She's upset with me. She's lost interest. I must have said something wrong. Suddenly, you're not in a relationship with her anymore. You're in a relationship with your own interpretation of her silence. And once you are in that headspace, everything she does becomes evidence to confirm your story. That's the psychology of misdirection. The brain hates uncertainty, so it fills in the gaps. But what it fills those gaps with isn't objective truth. It's the echo of your insecurities. You've probably been on the other side of this too. Maybe you didn't reply because you were in the middle of a meeting or you just needed a little quiet. Maybe you were preoccupied with something personal. But then you discover the other person has built an entire narrative about what your silence meant. Suddenly, you're cast as the villain in a story you didn't even know was being written. And you're left thinking, wait, when did my life become a Rorschach test for someone else's anxiety? We do this because absence is intolerable. Silence doesn't sit well with us. The human brain is wired for pattern recognition, for story taking. We evolved to make sense of every little cue, because back when our survival depended on reading the rustle in the bushes or the look on someone's face, missing why ignoring is more powerful than words. Signal could be the difference between life and death. But in modern relationships, that instinct often backfires. When someone withdraws, when someone ignores, we don't leave the space empty. We fill it, and what we fill it with depends on our attachment, our fears, our deepest scripts. A boot love and worthiness. If you grew up worrying about being abandoned, silence feels like confirmation that you're disposable. If you fear not being good enough, you'll interpret ignoring as proof you failed. If you crave control, that space will feel unbearable. So, you'll invent stories that at least give you the illusion of certainty. It's not her silence that hurts. It's your interpretation of her silence. Think of it like this. Silence as a blank canvas. One person might see it as space, as breathing room, as neutral. Another person sees it as rejection. Another sees it as punishment. Another sees it as a test, but the canvas is the same. The painting is your own projection. And here's where the dark psychology comes in. Ignoring Simeon can be intentional. It can be used as a tactic, a way of exerting control, of pulling strings without saying a word. It's powerful precisely because of the way our minds scramble to fill the gaps. It's why the silent treatment can be so damaging. When someone deliberately withholds, they're weaponizing your own meaning making against you. They know you'll build mastery, and the uncertainty gnaws at you. In some ways, it's more punishing than annuling ever could be. But most of the time, it isn't that calculated. Most of time, ignoring happens because someone is overwhelmed, distracted, afraid, or just unaware of the impact of their silence. And yet we don't experience it that way. We experience it through the lens of our misinterpretations. I once worked with a man who told me his girlfriend didn't really care about him, his evidence. She didn't respond quickly to his texts. He would send a message in the morning and maybe hear back in the afternoon. By then, his chest would be tight, his mind spinning. She must not be thinking about me. She doesn't prioritize me. Maybe she's seeing someone else. By the time she finally replied, he was cold, resentful. His silence back at her was now loaded with all the meaning he had created in those hours of waiting. When we unpacked this, he admitted he did the same thing at work. Sometimes he wouldn't answer emails for hours because he was in meetings. Sometimes he didn't reply to his family because he was tired. And yet when she did it, it meant rejection. The behavior was the same. The meaning he assigned was not. That's what emotional misdirection looks like in real life. The arrow isn't pointing toward her. It's pointing back toward him. Her delayed response was neutral. His story was not. Now, here's the invitation. The next time you feel ignored, notice what story your mind immediately writes. Does it say she doesn't care? Does it say she's mad at him? Does it say she must have found someone else? Notice the script, then pause. Ask yourself, is this her voice or mine? Is this reality or the shadow of an old fear playing out again? This pause is powerful because it interrupts the loop of projection. It allows you to hold your story with curiosity instead of certainty. And curiosity is where real connection begins. What if instead of assuming you asked? What if instead of retreating into resentment, you said, hey, I notice when I don't hear from you, I start to worry that something's wrong. Suddenly, the silence is no longer a blank canvas. You're painting alone. It becomes a shared space where clarity and reassurance can live. And sometimes the story your mind creates will be accurate. Sometimes silence does mean someone is losing interest. Sometimes it is avoidance or punishment or passive aggression. But the only way you'll know is if you're willing to test your story against reality. If you're willing to let the other person paint on the canvas with you. Ignoring a woman or anyone really is never just about the act itself. It's about the psychological theater it triggers inside you. And that the female mind, when attention disappears theater, is filled with props from your past. The parent who turned cold when you made a mistake. The partner wow through instead of talking. The friend who disappeared without explanation. The mind brings all of that history into the present moment. And suddenly one misreply isn't just about today. It's about every wound you've ever carried. That's why emotional misdirection is so compelling. It feels true because it's rooted in real pain, just not necessarily in the current situation. You're responding to ghosts, not to the person in front of you. The work I'm learning to recognize the difference, to notice when your story feels heavier than the facts, when your reaction feels bigger than the moment, to say, maybe I'm not actually reacting to her silence. Maybe I'm reacting to all the silences that came before. When you begin to see it this way, something shifts. You stop treating the other person like a mind reader. You stop demanding that they rescue you from uncertainty. Instead, you take responsibility for your own meaning making. You name it, you share it, you check it out. In reality, that doesn't mean you accept being ignored indefinitely. Boundaries still matter, respect still matters. But difference is you approach the situation from clarity rather than confusion, from reality rather than projection. And maybe that's the real art here. Not the art of ignoring, but the art of noticing. Noticing how quickly the mind turns absence into evidence. Noticing when your meaning making is pulling you down a path that might not be true. Noticing when silence becomes a stage for your insecurities rather than a reflection of someone else's. Intentions, because at the end of the day, the stories we tell ourselves are powerful. They can either isolate us or bring us closer. They can either deepen our wounds or open the door to healing. And every time we mistake our projections for the truth, we miss the chance to really see the other person. So the next time you find yourself in that uncomfortable gap, when message is left unanswered and the silence stretches a little too long, pause, notice what your mind is doing, notice the story you're writing, and then ask yourself, what if this isn't about her at all? What if the real meaning lives inside me? Because once you can see that, silence loses its power to misdirect. It becomes just what he always was, an empty space waiting for you to choose how to fill it. Silence is one of the most misunderstood languages we speak. It can be soft like a pause between two notes of music where what's unsaid is important as what's spoken, but it can also cut deeply like a blade wielded without ever raising a voice. Silence soothes, but it also wounds. It can mean I need space, or it can mean you don't matter. And often the difference between those two is not in silence itself, but in how it's received and in what story we attach to it. We rarely think of silence as communication, but it always is. When you don't answer, when you look away, when you withdraw into yourself, you are saying something even if you insist you're not. Sometimes what you're saying is, I don't have words right now. Other times, it's, I want you to feel what I'm feeling. Silence is never neutral. That's what makes it such a double-edged sword. Consider the person who goes quiet after an argument. On one hand, maybe they're trying not to escalate. Maybe they know that if they keep talking, they'll say something. They regret. Their silence then is an act of restraint, a pause, a holding back. When ignoring sparks attraction, recognition that space can prevent further harm. But the person on the receiving end rarely experiences it this way. For them, the quiet feels like a wall. It feels like abandonment, punishment, rejection. The same silence that feels like self-control to one person feels like exile to the other. This is the paradox. Silence has the power to protect connection, but it also has the power to destroy it. One person thinks they're giving space, the other thinks they're being erased. And isn't that so often how relationships break down, not from what's said, but from what's not said? We think words cause most of the damage, but more often it's the absence of them. The unanswered calls, the unturned texts, the look across the table that never comes. Silence tells a story, and the human mind, wired as it is to make meaning, rushes to fill the blanks. That story usually isn't generous. When someone ignores you, do you imagine they're busy, or do you imagine they don't care? Do you assume the silence is about them or about you? Most people assume the latter. Silence becomes a mirror, and what you see reflected back is your own fear. That's why silence can be such a cruel weapon. It doesn't just withhold presence. It forces you to confront your own insecurities. It makes you ask, why am I not worth responding? 2, it plays on your doubts. Because unlike words, silence leaves you with no clear place to stand. And in that uncertainty, the darker narratives grow. But here's the irony. Silence can also be one of the most healing choices we make. Sometimes saying nothing is the deepest act of care. Think about sitting with a friend who's grieving. You don't try to fix it. You don't rush in with glitches. You just sit there in the quiet and your silence says, I'm here. I can bear this with you. Or think about the moment when someone you love is overwhelmed. And instead of pressing for an answer, you give them breathing room. Silence in that context is compassion. The same tool used differently can comfort or can devastate. That's why it's a sword with two edges. The edge that creates safety and the edge that creates pain. And sometimes we don't even know which edge we're wielding. There's another layer to this. Silence doesn't just affect the person horse-hives it, it changes the person who gives it too. When you retreat into quiet as a defense mechanism, you might feel relief in the moment. You don't have to explain. You don't have to expose yourself. But over time, that silence corrodes intimacy. It builds distance you may not intend. What feels like protection becomes isolation. One that I spoke with told me he went silent whenever he was upset because as a child speaking up led to punishment. Learned early that silence was safer. So with his partner, whenever tension arose, he shut down. He thought he was avoiding conflict, but his partner experienced his silence as cruelty. To her, every quiet stretch felt like proof she didn't matter. To him, it was simply survival. Neither was wrong. But the silence lived between them like a ghost, haunting, unspoken, destructive. That's how silence works. It doesn't stay in any place. It expands. Like air filling a room until it becomes the atmosphere you both breathe. What complicates this even more is that silence is ambiguous by nature. A slammed door is unmistakable. A cutting remark is clearer, but silence is interpretation, which means silence is projection, and projection is dangerous. When you're ignored, you don't know what's really happening. So you invent a reason. And your invention is usually rooted in your own wounds. You tell yourself, she's ignoring me because she doesn't respect me. Or she's ignoring me because she's playing games. Or she's ignoring me because I'm not enough. Each story feels true, but notice how none of them come from her. They come from you. This is why silence becomes so powerful in relationships. It's not just the absence of sound. It's the presence of meaning. It's the canvas on which both people paint their fears, their strategies, their longings. And because the meanings rarely match, the silence, the dangers of using silence the wrong way becomes a battleground. If you've ever been given the silent treatment, you know how devastating it can feel. That's once used as punishment. It's not simply pulling away to cool down. It's pulling away to control, to make you squirm, to leave you chasing, apologizing, begging for scraps of attention. This is silence at its most manipulative. It doesn't solve conflict, it amplifies it by making you fight shadows instead of issues. And yet, silence can be used to save a relationship. When used intentionally with awareness, silence creates space for reflection. It prevents words spoken in anger. It allows emotions to settle before they spill out in regrettable ways. The problem is that most of us never communicate why we're going silent. We just do it. We leave the other person to guess. And in the guessing, pain grows. Imagine instead saying, I need a little time to process. I'll come back when I can talk calmly. Now, the silence isn't abandonment. It's respect. It's not exile. It's intention. The difference is in the quiet itself. The difference is in whether you offer context. That's the responsibility silence asks of us. If we're going to use it, we need to name it, because unspoken silence is rarely neutral. It's interpreted, and most of us interpret through the lens of our own scars. So what do we do with this sword we all carry? We learn to notice which edge we're using. We learn to pause and ask, am I silent to soothe or to punish? Am I silent to process or to control? And we learn to ask the same of others. Am I being ignored, or is this person overwhelmed? Am I being abandoned, or are they just taking a breath? We can't always know the answer, but even holding the question changes everything. It shifts us from certainty, she doesn't care, to curiosity. Maybe the silence isn't about me. Curiosity softens the edge. It makes silence less deadly, more workable. And maybe if we're brave enough, we break the silence, not with accusation, but with openness. We say, when you're quiet, I start to feel invisible. Is that what you mean to communicate? We give the other person a chance to fill in the blank, canvas themselves instead of letting our fear do the painting. Because silence will always be part of human connection. We can't avoid it. We will fall silent when we're tired, when we're scared, when we're unsure, when we're trying not to cause harm. But the silence itself is not the problem. The problem is when we wield it blindly, forgetting that this tool has two edges and that one edge can sever trust as quickly as the other can preserve it. In the end, silence asks us to be intentional, to use it as space, not as a weapon, to use it to build pause, not punishment, to remember that what we don't say can be just as loud as what we do say, and sometimes even louder. And if we can hold that awareness, if we can be mindful of the meanings that grow in the quiet, then silence no longer has to be something we fear. It becomes something we can share. Because silence doesn't have to divide, it can unite too. It can be the hand you hold without words, the pause that says, I hear you, the breath that makes room for another. And maybe that's the challenge too. Learn when silence is kindest choice and when words are the braver one. To know when to rest in the quiet and when to break it. To carry this sword carefully, knowing it can wound, but also knowing it can heal. You see, ignoring isn't neutral. It's an unspoken invitation. Perhaps to conflict or to reach out or for reassurance you never thought you needed. It hides your vulnerability behind a curtain of invisibility. Absence has a way of magnifying everything inside us. When someone pulls back, when they don't answer, when they leave us in silence, we think we're seeing them more clearly, but in reality, we're seeing ourselves. Absence is a mirror, and the reflection we're staring at is not their truth. It's our projection. Think about the subtle signs she notices your withdrawal last time someone ignored you. Maybe they didn't return your call. Maybe their text sat on read for hours, maybe days. Maybe they walked into a room and barely looked up. Whatever. The form, the absence wasn't neutral. You didn't experience it as empty. You experienced it as loaded. And almost instantly, your mind began the work of filling in the blanks. She must be upset. She doesn't care. She's slipping away. The story arrives fully formed before you even realize you've written it. That's the trap of projection. You're not reacting to her silence. You're reacting to the story your mind created in that silence. The absence becomes a canvas, and you paint it with the colors of your own fears, your own insecurities, your own history. And once you've painted it, you forget it was ever yours. You hold it up as evidence. See, this is who she is. But what you're really holding up is a mirror. The mind does this because uncertainty is unbearable. Silence is ambiguity. And humans aren't built to tolerate ambiguity. Well, we crave certainty. We want to know where we stand, what's expected, what's coming next. So when we don't know, we invent. We turn shadows into shapes. And those shapes look an awful lot like the ghosts we've carried all our lives. If you grew up with a parent who withdrew love when you made a mistake, you might read absence as punishment. If you had a partner who cheated, you might read silence as betrayal. If you've always felt not enough, you might read ignoring as rejection. It doesn't matter what the other person intended. The absence activates your old narrative. And suddenly, you're not just sitting with this moment's silence. You're sitting with every silence that ever hurt you. That's why it feels so overwhelming. It's not just about this person right now. It's about the accumulation of every time you felt unseen, unchosen, unwanted. The mirror of absence reflects not her indifference, but your wound, and that wound cries out for closure. The danger is that once you're in this projection, you behave. As if your story is fact, you pull back, you lash out. You send sharp messages, you retreat into coldness. You armor up against a threat that might not even exist. And in doing so, you create the very distance you feared. You write a script, then you act it out. And before long, the play becomes real. What began as projection ends up as prophecy, but here's the thing, projection isn't always cruel. Sometimes it's hopeful, sometimes you fill the absence with fantasy. Instead of fear, maybe you convince yourself her silence means she's thinking deeply about you, that her distance is mysterious rather than dismissive. Maybe you romanticize her lack of response as proof of independence or allure. That's projection, too, and it's just as misleading, because whether it's optimism or pessimism, it's still your story, not hers. Absence is neutral until we give it meaning. But we rarely leave it neutral. We can't stand the blank space, so we rush to fill it. And because our minds are shaped more by memory than by present reality, what we fill it with is usually old fears, old patterns, old echoes. We think we're interpreting her, but really we're reliving ourselves. I once heard Samia describe this beautifully. When a partner goes quiet, it's like standing in front of a funhouse mirror. Their reflection is distorted, stretched, bent. You see yourself, but not quite. You think you're seeing her, but what you're really seeing is your own shape, altered by the bend of silence. So what do we do with this mirror? How do we stop mistaking our reflection for her reality? The first step is noticing. The moment you feel the pull of absence, ask yourself, what story am I telling right now? Am I assuming rejection? Am I assuming punishment? Am I assuming she's gone? Just naming the story loosens its grip. It reminds you this is mine, not necessarily hers. The second step is curiosity. Instead of sealing your story as truth, hold it lightly. Wonder about it. Could there be another explanation? Maybe she's tired. Maybe she's busy. Maybe she's avoiding for reasons that have nothing to do with you. Or maybe how ignoring creates curiosity and to see your story is true, but you don't know until you check. And checking requires vulnerability. It requires asking, not assuming. That's the hardest part because asking risks sharing an answer you don't want. Projection, while comforting in themament, is far more dangerous. It traps you in the safety of your imagination, but it also guarantees disconnection. Asking at least offers the chance for clarity. It offers the possibility of repair. The mirror of absence is seductive because it feels like control. When you decide what her silence means, you regain a sense of certainty, but that certainty is false. It protects you from the discomfort of not knowing, but it also blinds you from what's real. And what's real is often less catastrophic, but also more complex than the story as you spin. Absence can mean many things. It can mean fear. It can mean distraction. It can mean resentment. It can mean exhaustion. It can mean she's not interested, or it can mean she's so interested that she doesn't know how to respond. Silence is multivalent. It holds all possibilities. Projection collapses those possibilities into one story, and then convinces you it's the only story. Think of absence like an ink blot. One person sees a butterfly, another sees a bat, another sees nothing at all. The ink blot doesn't change. The interpretation does. Silence is the same. And what you see in it reveals more about you than about her. If you really want to know what her silence means, you have to risk stepping out off mirror. You have to turn away from your projection and toward her actual voice, and that takes courage. It takes humility to admit that your story might be wrong. It takes honesty to say, here's what I made up in my head when you didn't respond. Can you tell me what's really going on? That kind of conversation is uncomfortable, but it's also liberating because when you stop relating to your projection and start relating to the person in front of you, you give yourself the gift of reality. You no longer waste energy fighting ghosts. You get to deal with what's actually there. And sometimes what's there is painful. Sometimes the silence does mean distance or loss or disinterest. But even then, clarity is kinder than projection. At least with clarity, you can respond to reality instead of spiraling in stories. At least with clarity, you can choose. Stay, go, talk, decide. Projection leaves you paralyzed, chasing an answer that only exists inside your head. So when the mirror of absence appears, notice it. Notice how quickly your mind rushes to draw conclusions. Notice the shape of your story. Is it one of fear, of fantasy, of longing? And then remind yourself, this is me. This is my reflection. This may have nothing to do with her. That doesn't mean your story is meaningless. Quite the opposite. The story you create in silence reveals your deepest patterns. It shows you where you're wounded, where you crave reassurance, where you struggle to trust. It's valuable information, not about her, but about you. And if you're willing to use it that way, the mirror of absence becomes a teacher instead of a trap. In the end, absence will always happen. People will always pull back, go quiet, disappear for moments or for days. You can't control that. What you can control is what you project onto the silence. You can decide whether to mistake the mirror for the truth or to see it as a reflection of your own inner world. Because absence doesn't actually tell you who she is. It tells you who you are when faced with not knowing. And maybe that's the most important thing to learn. Every silence carries an invitation. It may not feel that way at first. It may feel like rejection, like abandonment, like proof that something is slipping through your fingers. But beneath the absence, beneath the quiet, there's often an unspoken question. Will this be a space for repair? Or will this be the moment of retreat? When someone ignores you, it rarely exists in a vacuum. It's not just about the unanswered text or the lack of eye contact across the room. It's about what the fine line between respect and manipulation that gap represents. For some, ignoring is a plea for space, for calm, for the dust to settle. For others, ignoring is a form of retreat, a step back toward distance, a way of saying, without words, I'm no longer willing to engage. The same action, silence, can mean two completely different things. And how we respond to that silence determines whether thestory becomes one of repair or of retreat. The hardest part is that we don't usually name it. We don't say, I need to. Step away so I don't say something I regret. Or I'm shutting down because I don't know how to tell you I'm hurt. Instead, we leave it unsaid. And when it's unsaid, the person on the receiving end is left to guess. And the guessing often feels like a rejection. Repair is about leaning back in, but retreat is about closing off. The problem is both can start the same way with silence. That's why ignoring feels so confusing, so painful. You don't know if it's the first step toward healing or the first step toward leaving. And in that uncertainty, most of us panic. When we panic, we usually do one of two things. We chase or we withdraw. We chase by demanding answers, sending multiple messages, trying to pull the other person back before we even understand why they left. Or we withdraw by matching their silence with our own, retreating into pride or self-protection. Both responses, while understandable, often push the relationship further toward retreat. The chase overwhelms. The withdrawal deepens the gap. Repair, though, requires something harder. It requires slowing down. It requires curiosity. It requires saying, I notice there's distance between us right now. I don't know what it means, but I'd like to understand. Repair invites conversation where retreat leaves only assumptions. Repair says, I want to meet you in the middle, while retreat says, I'll stay in my corner and you stay in yours. It's tempting to assume that ignoring is always malicious, that it always signals retreat, but often ignoring is a clumsy attempt at repair. A partner might think, if I pull back, I won't make things worse. If I stay quiet, maybe we'll calm down and be able to talk. The intention isn't to hurt, but to preserve. The problem is silence without explanation rarely feels like preservation. It feels like punishment. And so what was meant as a bridge becomes a wall. Imagine two people standing on opposite sides of a river. One goes quiet, thinking the stillness will make it easier to build a bridge. The other interprets the quiet as abandonment and starts building a boat to drift away. Both believe they're responding reasonably, but the river only widens. Repair never happens, because neither person says out loud what their silence was meant to do. That's why naming matters. If you need space, say so. If you're too hurt to speak, say so. If you're scared of what might come out of your mouth, say so. Giving context turns ignoring into communication, however minimal. Without context, the other person has no choice but to fill in the silence with their own fears. And that's when retreat takes root. Repair is not about never going slant. Repair is about how you come back. It's about whether silence becomes a pause or a full stop. Think about the last time you pulled away from someone. Did you return with openness, with an attempt to bridge the distance, with a willingness to hear and be heard? Or did you use silence as an exit, leaving the other person stranded in the dark? Both might have looked the same at first. The difference was whether you walked back across the gap or let it harden into finality. The mirror of relationships then shows us that retreat is easier in the moment, but costlier in the long run. It spares us discomfort now, but leaves us with emptiness later. Repair, by contrast, is harder in the moment, but sustaining in the long run. It forces you to face what we fear: vulnerability, conflict, imperfection. But it also, when to re-engage after ignorance gives us the possibility of closeness that silence alone can never provide. The danger of ignoring is that it leaves the invitation unanswered. And when an invitation is unanswered long enough, it expires. The other person stops waiting. They stop wondering if this silence is a pause or a punishment. They assume it's the latter, and they retreat too. That's how relationships unravel. Not with a blowout, but with the slow erosion of unanswered invitations. Sometimes retreat is necessary. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away from someone who continually ignores, manipulates, or punishes with silence. Sometimes retreat isn't avoidance. It's self-respect. The question isn't whether retreat is always bad. The question is whether you're retreating as a choice or as a reflex. Are you retreating to protect your boundaries, or are you retreating to avoid the hard work of repair? The truth is, ignoring is a fork in the road. It can lead to healing if it's used as space for reflection followed by returner. It can lead to distance if it becomes a substitute for conversation. The fork looks the same at first, a moment of absence of silence. But which path it becomes depends on whether the silence is eventually bridged. Repair is vulnerable. It requires saying, I felt hurt, or I felt scared, or I didn't know how to handle this. Repair risks rejection, but it also opens the door to intimacy. Retreat, by contrast, requires nothing in the moment, but it guarantees distance. The question each of us has to ask is, what do I want this silence to mean? Do I want it to be a pause that helps me return stronger? Or do I want it to be the way I exit without saying goodbye? Both are valid in different contexts. But the danger is when we choose retreat by default without realizing repair was an option. When you're on the receiving end of silence, you face your own fork in the road. You can fill the absence with projection, assuming the worst, retreating yourself, or you can treat the silence as an invitation to check in. I notice some distance. Can we talk about it? You can't control whether the other person accepts the invitation, but you can control whether you offer it. That choice alone can shift that trajectory. Sometimes the invitation will be declined. Sometimes the silence really does mean retreat, and there's nothing you can do to change it. But even then, you'll know. You'll have clarity, and clarity, even when painful, is always kinder than limbo. Because at least then you can make your own choice whether to wait, to let go, or to move forward. Ignoring then is less about what one person does and more about what both people choose to do with it. It's a crossroads disguised as nothingness. And if we learn to see it that way, we stop treating silence as the end of the story and start treating it as a turning point. The next time you feel ignored, pause before filling in the silence with your fears. Ask yourself, is this an invitation for repair or is this a signal of retreat? And if you don't know, ask, don't demand. Don't accuse, just invite. I feel some distance. Can we bridge it? If the answer is no, you'll know where you stand. If the answer is yes, you've transformed absence into connection. Every silence carries a choice. Every absence offers a fork, and though you can control which way someone else will walk, you can decide how you'll show up at that crossroads. Will you retreat into your own silence, or will you take the risk of inviting repair? That choice is always yours, and maybe that's the quiet truth. Silence doesn't have to be an ending. Sometimes, if we're willing to see the invitation side it, silence can be the very place where repair begins. So what if we turn this on its head? What if instead of disappearing, you leaned in just for a moment and said, I was scared. I'm not great at this. That choice, that act of clarity and courage, that's real connection. Suddenly silence isn't an art form of avoidance. It's the beginning of an honest conversation. And that, my friends, is the beauty in breaking the default. Because ignoring someone might feel safe, but it leaves you and them stranded in your assumptions alone. And believe me, alone is much darker than any silence could ever.